Have you ever heard of Wouter Basson? I mean, the name just sounds like something out of like a spy thriller or something,
Yeah, it
doesn't it?
really does. But what's crazy is that he was a real person, and he was a doctor who was like super involved with the South African apartheid regime
Oh, wow.
and all of its darkest secrets. So we're talking about a super secret chemical and biological warfare program called Project Coast.
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting to me. Project Coast was all about developing weapons,
Hmm.
as I understand it, but our deep dive today is going to focus on something maybe a little less conventional.
Okay.
We're going to be looking at the alleged weaponization of street drugs, specifically mandrax.
Right. Yeah. The accusations against Basson are pretty disturbing. He was accused of weaponizing a bunch of different drugs,
Uh-huh.
MDMA, LSD, you name it.
Wow.
But it seems like mandrax is like at the center of this whole crazy story. And his trial in 1999 kind of painted this picture of a guy who was trying to control and suppress potential anti-apartheid uprisings, using chemicals to do that.
But the sources that we've gathered for this deep dive suggest that things might be even more complicated than that. Like, how do you even weaponize a drug like mandrax?
Yeah.
And was Besson acting on his own, or was he just part of a much bigger, more sinister-like operation?
Yeah, those are the questions everyone wants answered. And to make things even more complicated, there's not much concrete evidence about Basson's methods, and then he was acquitted of all charges in 2002.
It's like Project Coast was designed to be impenetrable. Like they intentionally made it super secret to protect the people involved.
Right.
It's kind of like a hall of mirrors. You can't tell what's true and what's not.
That's a really good analogy, and it makes the work of people like Jenny Wild so important. She was a human rights lawyer who fought really hard against apartheid,
Yeah.
and she played a key role in exposing Project Coast's drug research, and Wild was totally convinced that the apartheid government would do anything to stay in control, and what they were doing was chillingly similar to like the horrible stuff the Nazis did.
It's just disturbing to think that doctors, people who are supposed to heal and protect people were allegedly involved in making drugs to hurt people.
Yeah.
And then there's the whole mandrax thing. It went from being almost unheard of in South Africa to having tens of thousands of addicts in a really short amount of time.
Right.
Do we know if that was just a coincidence, or could it be connected to Project Coast?
Well, some people think that the huge increase in mandrax addiction was like a planned strategy by the apartheid regime, to keep the population under control.
Wow.
But even if we don't believe that theory, the amount of mandrax that was being made during that time is just insane.
And that's where the forensic scientist report comes in, right? The one who looked at all the chemicals that were seized after they shut down Project Coast.
Exactly. And what they found is pretty crazy.
Okay.
Enough chemicals to make millions of mandrax tablets.
Millions. That's a crazy amount. If they were just trying to stop riots, why would they make mandrax tablets? Wouldn't it make more sense to use tear gas or other more traditional crowd control methods?
You'd think. So it's really hard to imagine a situation where someone would use mandrax tablets for crowd control. And I just can't help but think that those millions of tablets might have ended up somewhere a little more profitable.
You mean the black market? You think Project Coast might have been selling mandrax on the black market?
It's definitely possible, and if it's true, it just adds a whole other layer of messed up stuff to this already messed up story. But even if we say that Basson was just following orders, doing what the higher-ups in the apartheid government told him to do, there's still the question of who's responsible.
Right. Where does personal responsibility end and blind obedience begin?
Exactly. We talked to someone who wanted to stay anonymous, and they said that Basson was basically a soldier, trapped in a brutal system.
Oh, wow.
But even this person admitted that Basson might have gone too far. Maybe he did stuff for personal gain, or maybe he thought he was being super patriotic or something.
It's like a puzzle with a bunch of missing pieces. But how do we even start to figure out what really happened? Yeah. Especially when the people involved want to keep their secrets hidden.
Well, that's where Chandra Gould comes in. She's like the leading expert on Project Coast.
Okay.
Her book, Secrets and Lies, really digs into Basson's alleged crimes and his trial. She says that Project Coast was basically designed to be impossible to expose.
So it's going to be really hard to prove anything for sure.
Yeah.
But what does Basson say about all of this? Does he deny doing anything wrong?
He says he's innocent. He claims that he was developing weaponized mandrax tablets to put in grenades and mortars, which is something that a lot of experts think is
Really?
pretty ridiculous.
So he's basically saying, prove it.
Yeah, and to make things even more unsettling, Basson's still practicing medicine, and he's even become a motivational speaker.
It's crazy to think that someone who was accused of such awful things could just go on with their life like nothing happened. This is one of those deep dives that makes me question everything.
Yeah, it really is a chilling thought, isn't it? I mean, just the audacity of someone accused of weaponizing drugs and maybe even helping to start a whole epidemic to then like turn around and try to be some kind of inspirational figure.
Right.
It really makes you think about how complicated justice can be, especially in South Africa after apartheid.
And, you know, speaking of complicated stuff, I'm still stuck on this whole mandrax thing. We've talked about how there was a huge surplus of mandrax produced during the time of Project Coast, way more than could ever be explained by, you know, any kind of legitimate crowd control efforts.
Yeah, the amount they were making just doesn't make sense, does it? Even if we believe Basson's story about weaponized mandrax tablets for grenades, which like most experts think is ridiculous anyway, it still wouldn't explain all those chemicals they found.
Okay.
Right.
So that brings us back to the question of, like, where did all that mandrax go? It seems really unlikely that millions of tablets just vanished.
It does, and I think the forensic scientist report gives us a really important clue. You know, millions of mandrax tablets means that someone was deliberately and in an organized way trying to distribute the drug.
Okay.
And given everything else we know, the most likely way they would have done that is the black market.
So are you saying that Project Coast, a government program, was actually involved in the illegal drug trade?
I know it's a big claim, but think about the evidence. We've got a ton of mandrax being made under the cover of this super secret program, and the whole program is about suppressing dissent and staying in control.
Right. And if you think about it, mandrax addiction could be a really effective way to control people.
Right.
I mean, people who are addicted to drugs are less likely to challenge the government.
Exactly. It creates a cycle of dependency, you know, both physical and psychological, and that makes it super hard for people to break free and fight for their rights.
This whole thing is starting to sound really Machiavellian. Like, if it's true, it means that the government was willing to use its own people's weaknesses to stay in power.
It's a disturbing thought, but it does fit with what Jenny Wild said about the apartheid government being willing to use brutal tactics like the Nazis, you know, deliberately making people addicted to drugs, especially people who are already marginalized and oppressed. That's basically using a chemical weapon.
It's a sad reminder that wanting power can corrupt even the smartest people and make them do really terrible things.
And the consequences of those actions can last for generations.
Yeah.
You know, all that mandrax addiction would have destroyed communities, broken up families, and contributed to the poverty and violence that South Africa is still dealing with today.
This is one of those deep dives where the more we find out, the more questions we have.
Yeah.
But let's go back to Basson for a second. What happened to him after the trial? We know he was acquitted, but what happened after that?
Yeah, his acquittal in 2002 was pretty controversial, especially considering how serious the accusations against him were.
Right.
A lot of people thought it was a failure of the justice system.
Right.
You know, like they couldn't hold a powerful person accountable for what he did.
But how could they let him go with all that evidence pointing to his involvement in Project Coast? We're talking about a secret program to develop chemical and biological weapons. There's got to be some kind of paper trail, right? Some documents that link him to all this.
You would think so, right? But remember that Project Coast was built on plausible deniability. You know, it was designed to hide the truth.
Okay.
So it's really hard to connect Basson directly to specific crimes.
So the program itself was like a weapon protecting the people involved from being investigated and held accountable.
Right.
But even if Basson was just a small part of it, all his actions, if they're true, caused a lot of suffering. And to just walk away from that, to keep being a doctor like nothing happened, is just mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's hard for a lot of people to understand, you know, the idea that someone who's been accused of such terrible things can still be in a position of authority, can still be trusted to take care of people.
Right.
It causes a lot of pain and frustration for the people who lived through apartheid.
It makes you think about justice and accountability, and how the effects of a regime like that can last for so long. It suggests that the wounds from the past are still healing, and the search for truth and reconciliation is something that's still going on.
And for the people who were directly affected by Project Coast, by all the mandrax and the damage it did to their communities, the fight for justice isn't over.
Right.
Their stories need to be heard, their pain needs to be acknowledged, and their voices need to be amplified.
It's our job to keep these conversations going, to bring light to the dark parts of our history, and to make sure that the victims of these terrible things aren't forgotten. But how do we do that? How do we make sure that Project Coast and the lessons we can learn from it don't just fade away?
By continuing to investigate, to dig deeper into the records, to find new people to talk to, and to challenge the official stories that often protect the powerful from being scrutinized, by giving a voice to the people who are silenced and marginalized and letting them share their experiences and demand accountability.
It feels like we've only just started to uncover this story. Like there's so much more to find out, so many questions that are still unanswered. But I keep thinking about the scientists who were involved in Project Coast. Were they all really true believers? Or were some of them just trapped in something they couldn't get out of?
It's a question that I think about too,
Yeah.
to imagine all these brilliant minds, people who dedicated their lives to science, using their knowledge to make weapons that could cause so much destruction. It's really hard to understand.
Yeah, I mean, these were people who probably took an oath to, like, do no harm.
Hmm.
How do you reconcile that with working on a program that's all about hurting people, controlling them, and oppressing them?
It's definitely a moral dilemma, and I think it's really important to understand the context of apartheid. We
Yeah.
can't ignore how powerful that ideology was, that belief in racial hierarchy that was everywhere in society.
So maybe some of these scientists really did think they were doing the right thing for their country, even if it meant going against their own ethics.
It's a scary thought, but it could be true. They might have justified their actions, convincing themselves that they were protecting their way of life, their families, even their own existence.
But there had to be some people who questioned what they were doing right. Weren't there any dissenting voices within Project Coast?
I'm sure there were, but speaking out against the apartheid regime was incredibly dangerous. I mean, you could get killed.
Oh, wow.
So for some people, it might have been a matter of survival. They participated because they felt like they didn't have any other choice.
It's hard to accept that, but it's something we need to think about. We can't ignore the pressure and fear that people faced back then. Even the most ethical and compassionate person could be forced to do terrible things when they're facing that kind of violence.
Right.
It kind of makes you think about human nature in a negative way, doesn't it? Even people who want to heal and help others can be manipulated into becoming tools of oppression.
It does, but it also shows how important moral courage is. The people who, despite the risks, stood up and spoke out against injustice, people like Jenny Wild, they're the real heroes of this story.
Yeah, their actions remind us that even in the darkest times, hope and resilience can still exist. But what about the victims? What about the long-term impact of Project Coast on South Africa, on all those communities that were devastated by mandrax addiction?
The consequences of Project Coast are huge, and they affect multiple generations. All that mandrax that was available during apartheid, whether it was intentional or not, has really hurt a lot of people.
Yeah, we've talked about the social control aspect, using addiction to keep people quiet. But what about the human cost? The families that were torn apart, the poverty and the violence, the loss of trust in community.
Those are the scars that Project Coast has left on South Africa. The trauma that was inflicted on individuals and communities is still felt today. It shows up in mental health problems, substance abuse, and social breakdown.
And it's not just the people who were addicted to mandrax. It's the psychological impact of knowing that your own government was making chemical weapons to use against you, that scientists were working to hurt you and control you. That's a really deep wound that takes a long time to heal.
It's a betrayal of trust at the deepest level, and it shows how badly South Africa needs truth and reconciliation, a process that recognizes all the harm that apartheid caused and the damage done by programs like Project Coast.
It seems like justice is a long way off, especially for the people who are still suffering from the effects of Project Coast. But is there anything we can do, as people who weren't there to help make sure that people are held accountable and to promote healing?
We might not be in South Africa, but we can still make a difference. The most important thing is to educate ourselves, learn about the history of apartheid and the terrible things that were done in the name of racial purity. We can listen to the stories of the people who are affected by Project Coast and amplify their voices.
Right. And what about supporting organizations that are working in South Africa? Groups that are fighting for human rights, providing addiction recovery services, and advocating for social justice.
Definitely. There are so many organizations doing amazing work to address the legacy of apartheid and help communities heal and become stronger. Donating to these organizations, volunteering our time, or just spreading the word about what they're doing can really make a difference.
Yeah, it reminds us that even small actions can have an impact. We can't change history,
Yeah.
but we can choose to be on the side of justice and work towards a future where these kinds of terrible things never happen again.
Well said. This deep dive into Project Coast has been a journey into a really dark part of history. It reminds us how capable humans are of both incredible cruelty and incredible resilience. It's a story that makes us face some uncomfortable truths, examine our own biases, and challenge systems of oppression wherever we find them.
It's a call to action, a challenge to get involved in the ongoing fight for justice and equality, not just in South Africa, but everywhere.
And while the road ahead might be long and difficult, we can find inspiration from the people who fought so hard against apartheid, the people who spoke truth to power, and the people who are still working towards a more just and equitable world.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Project Coast. We hope this exploration has made you curious and maybe even a little outraged, and that it's inspired you to learn more and get involved.
Remember, the pursuit of truth and justice is something we all have to do together, and even the smallest acts of courage and compassion can help create a world where the horrors of the past are never forgotten and never repeated.